If selfishness is the motive behind everything that somebody does, how much would you like to be around that person? If selfishness is something that sets the standard for what they say, for what they think, for what they believe, for how they live, for everything that they do, it's really kind of detrimental ultimately to them, but they may be the last individuals to ever notice it. In 1 Kings, in the Old Testament, 1 Kings chapter 11 and following, there's a story that really surrounds the last of the rule of Solomon, the last days of his kingdom before he passes away. Two individuals come to light that actually both have that kind of selfish mindset. One is the son of Solomon, Rehoboam, who will become king in his place after Solomon dies. The other is a servant in the throne, around the throne of Solomon, and an individual that obviously has some leadership qualities that are very well noted because of what takes place. His name is Jeroboam. Before Solomon dies, there's a prophet that actually pulls Jeroboam aside and says, God will tear the kingdom out of the hand of Solomon and give you 10 of those 12 tribes. The reason being, 1 Kings 11, verse 33, they have forsaken me. They started worshiping all sorts of idols. They've not walked in my ways. They're not doing what's right. They're not keeping my statutes. They've forgotten me, and they've forgotten those principles that were given to them, to the nation, at the hand of Moses. So the statement's made to Jeroboam in verse number 38. If you heed all that I command you, walk in my ways, and do what is right in my sight, to keep my statutes and my commandments as my servant David did, then I'll be with you and build for you an enduring house as built for David. I'll give Israel to you. Substantial promise. The leadership abilities of Jeroboam, I said, were well noted. And you see that because 2 verses later, in verse 40, Solomon actually sought to kill Jeroboam, but Jeroboam flees and goes down to Egypt. After Solomon dies, Rehoboam becomes king in his place. Jeroboam comes back. And Jeroboam and the assembly of the leaders of Israel actually come before this new king with this statement, and actually a pledge. Chapter 12 and verse 4, your father made our yoke, our burden, heavy. Now therefore lighten the burdensome service of your father and his heavy yoke which he put on us, and we will serve you. Rebalm says, give me 3 days to think about it and come back. Well, he consults with the young advisors he put in the place of those mature individuals that actually had served as advisors to Solomon. And they gave him some advice to not lighten the load upon the people, but just do the opposite. You think, but what does that mean? Solomon had a tremendous amount of growth to take place. A lot of things were built during the rule of Solomon. That came at a price. When you think of what Rehoboam can do that actually is harsher than his father, well, you thought my father taxed you? You haven't seen anything yet. You thought my father conscripted you into service for some of these building projects and other things around the kingdom? Just wait. So when these leaders come back in front of this new king, here's what he says. My father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father chastised you with whips. I will chastise you with scorpions. You think it was hard under Solomon, my father? It's going to be excruciatingly more difficult under me. No wonder that 10 tribes revolt. Jeroboam becomes king of a northern kingdom that's now goes by the name of the nation of Israel. Rehoboam rules in the south, the kingdom of Judah. That selfishness of Rehoboam, that kind of mindset, listening to people that really were inexperienced and obviously had some kind of agenda of their own, did not work out well. Did not work out for his best interest. What about Jeroboam? In chapter 12, down in verse 26, Jeroboam says in his heart, now the kingdom may return to the house of David. I don't want them to go back. So what can I do to keep them here? There's an aspect to that selfishness where there's a conniving aspect, and you see it illustrated in the process of what Jeroboam actually does. He makes a statement down in verse 27. This is what he's thinking. If these people go up to offer sacrifices in the house of the Lord at Jerusalem, then the heart of this people will turn back to their Lord Rehoboam, king of Judah. They'll come back and will kill me and go back to Rehoboam, king of Judah. I'll lose these 10 tribes. I'll lose this northern kingdom. They'll all go back. If you start thinking, however, of the options and the alternatives, so you think the actual will turn away from you and go back to an individual that has stated out loud he's going to make their life miserable with burdens that they do not want to live under? Why would they go back? It really doesn't make any sense. That kind of conniving kind of aspect of Jeroboam, however, leads to some other problems. Verse 28, therefore the king asked advice and made 2 calves of gold and said to the people, it's too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, O Israel, which brought you up out of the land of Egypt. So what do you do? If you're going to keep the people there, what do you do? Let's do it. Let's make a counterfeit religion. Let's just come up with something that we can actually sell. So this counterfeit religion is something that we're going to say makes it more convenient. You don't have to go all the way back down to Jerusalem, to the temple. In fact, we don't want you to do that at all. We're going to make this as easy for you as possible. Why would they refuse? So with this counterfeit religion, we're going to make it something that is very convenient for the people. And we're going to convince them as best we can that, well, really, when your ancestors came out of Egyptian bondage, it wasn't Yahweh. It was golden calves that actually were the gods that brought you out of Egypt. And if they think back to their history, they know that that's not true. But hey, this is convenient and it's a new kingdom, and so why not let's just go along with it. Counterfeit religion, make it very convenient for the people to follow, convince them that what they're doing is correct, and if they think about it, they will determine otherwise. And then the statement is made in verse 31 and 32. He made shrines on the high places, made priests from every class of people who were not of the tribe of Levi. Jeroboam ordained a feast on the 15th day of the 8th month, like the feast that was in Judah. Offered sacrifices on the altar. He did it at Bethel and sacrificed to calves he'd made. At Bethel he had installed the priest of the high places which he'd made. Jeroboam, what are you doing? I'm actually making something as comparable to what they left as I possibly can. So I'm going to actually start this counterfeit religion. We're going to make it convenient for them. I'm going to convince them that these idols are what they need to be worshiping all along. I'm going to make it very comparable because we'll have feast days that are very similar. In fact, they'll occur on the calendar the same days as these feast days in that southern kingdom of Judah there at the temple at Jerusalem. It works out initially where the people actually follow that. The statement is made down in verse 33 that after he offered these sacrifices on the altar, he did it in the month which he had devised in his own heart to match those days that were found in the law of Moses. It's a concocted kind of arrangement. It's not based on anything other than his own selfish desires. Later on you find that the kingdom of Rehoboam and the kingdom of Jeroboam fought each other all the days of their lives. Never was a positive process to make the burden heavy on the nation. You lost most of the nation, Rehoboam, when you did that. It's not in the best interest of this new nation, Jeroboam, to actually invent something that has no basis whatsoever, because you are afraid that what you've been promised won't happen, that you forget that these individuals, every time they go back down to that southern kingdom and see the burdensome atrocities of King Rehoboam, they're not going to go back to Rehoboam. If anything, that'd make their loyalty to you that much greater. But that's not something that you consider, because selfishness is ingrained in you just as much as the selfishness in Rehoboam. Now, submit a lot of things involved on both sides of this story, both on the side of Rehoboam and the side of Jeroboam, mirror a lot of atrocities that occur in our culture today. People fighting for a cause that may be selfish. They don't perceive it to be selfish. It may be concocted. It may actually emphasize things that are totally out of kilter with what reality actually is. but you can get a following for almost anything because people don't check facts. So the kind of mindset of Jeroboam is not something that is conducive to the betterment of those around him. He's not concerned with others. He's not really even thinking long term about the outcome. Same is true for Rehoboam. He's not thinking about others. There's a tremendous amount of arrogance and pride and the harshness that he wants to bring upon the people. He's not really thinking about the ultimate outcome. I don't think he actually envisioned losing more than half of the nation to a rival king in the north. How do people respond to selfishness today? Oftentimes they don't even see it. They will see the selfishness of others without seeing selfishness in themselves. That's tragic. Well, how do I overcome that? By making sure that I don't just work based on my emotions, that thought has to be involved in that process in a very grand way. I need to be thinking about consequences, but I need to actually use logic and rationality as much as I possibly can in the way that I approach life and those around me. Scripture actually has some tremendous lessons to learn in the way that we deal with other people. Along the way, there are some lessons for ways that we need to abstain from, run from, avoid totally. No one should have the mindset of either Rehoboam or Jeroboam. Ultimately, it's doomed to failure. Interesting stories in the Old Testament that have some tremendous applicable lessons for us today. Interesting chapters. Please stay safe. We'll talk again soon.